Firstly, Ambassador, thank you very much both for hosting this and also for RSIS and yourselves hospitality during the last few weeks. It's been a real privilege to be here in Singapore, and hopefully they might hear this on the video, to Sion and to Cindy for their wonderful assistance over the last, again, few weeks. To those in the room, apologies that this is rather formal, but because of the videoing, I think it's better to do it, to make the presentation this way. Let me start by saying that if you were in favour of Brexit, generally you didn't become in favour of Brexit for economic reasons. And generally you didn't think much beyond the consequences of what Brexit might mean. But I think most people, unless they were real purblind Brexiteers, knew that Britain would face serious economic challenges outside the European Union. What I think was perhaps underestimated inside the UK, and perhaps specifically in England, was the constitutional challenges that Brexit might pose. Let me though start with the economic and then move on to the constitutional. The UK has left the EU, as you know, and in doing so we've left the biggest single market in the world and the biggest customs union in the world. No one knows what will replace it, but the only certainty, which has really only emerged as a certainty in the last 2 weeks, is that the UK and the EU will no longer have frictionless trade. And this was a point reinforced only on Monday by Michael Gove, who is in the British Cabinet and sometimes described by the British press as the de facto Deputy Prime Minister. He said, the UK will be outside the single market and outside the customs union, so we will have to be ready for the customs procedures and regulatory checks that will inevitably follow. So no doubt about where he sees the trade relationship. After 40 months of negotiations, 3 extensions to Article 50 and 2 draft agreements endorsed by 27 EU leaders and 2 UK Prime Ministers, the approval of the treaty setting out the UK's withdrawal from the EU were finally ratified in January this year. And as you know, we left on the 31st. The withdrawal agreement was in 2 parts. An extensive legal document setting out the agreed financial settlement, the rights of UK and EU citizens, and the method of ensuring the absence of a hard border between the north and the south of Ireland. It also, though, set out the rules for the transition period. The transition or implementation period is to last until the 31st of December this year. During this time, although a third country, the UK is treated as a member state, but without any decision-making or representation rights, and this period can be extended once before the 1st of July for up to 1 or 2 years. The transition period was designed to allow time for negotiations on the future partnership. While Boris Johnson insists that it can be done and has ruled out an extension, most experts consider this timetable as unrealistic, and particularly unrealistic if we are to reach a comprehensive agreement in all the relevant areas. And these are the trade relationship, security cooperation, immigration, data sharing, fisheries, and so on. And getting an agreement, which was going to be difficult anyway, will be even tougher if the UK really means it's going to want to diverge significantly from EU standards after this transition period. This takes us to the second document in the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration. The political declaration is not legally binding, but initially it was meant to be a design for what this graphic shows, a single architectural structure for the future relationship between the EU and the UK. The changes between the first agreement and that is the one signed by Theresa May, and the second agreement signed by Boris Johnson shows a much lower level of ambition for our future relationship with the European Union. Negotiations begin with the UK appearing to want to move away from EU standards, but retaining maximum access to the EU single market. Both sides have talked about a tariff-free, quota-free trade deal, but the EU has made it absolutely clear, repeatedly in the last, again, few weeks when the whole temperature has been rising, that any agreement that gives a level playing field, that gives preferential access to the United Kingdom, would be dependent on what they call a level playing field. And just in passing, it's worth noting that there is no country in the world at the moment that already has 100% duty-free and quota-free access to the European Union market. Speaking in London just last month, the European Commission President said that an EU offer on tariff-free, quota-free trade would be dependent on alignment with the bloc's fundamental rules. And in the same speech, which was to the London School of Economics, she warned that any new partnership cannot and will not be as close as before, because with every choice comes a consequence, with every decision a trade-off. The more divergence there is, the more distant the relationship must be, and without any extension of the transition period beyond 2020, you cannot expect to agree on every aspect of the new partnership. And again, let me be clear, the EU's tough line is not about punishing the United Kingdom, but it's based on two hard-headed considerations. Firstly, it recognises that if a third country, and indeed specifically a former member state, can get the same benefits of membership, it undermines the value of membership. If you could play on your local golf course without paying fees and according to your own rules, why on earth would you bother to sign up and pay the dues? The second consideration is the danger that the EU perceives of having a low-tax, deregulatory regime on its doorstep with full access to its market. And here I think the EU is correct to be concerned. This, after all, was the appeal Mr Johnson's redraft of the political declaration accompanying the withdrawal agreement had to the Conservative right compared to the deal that Mrs May struck. Mrs May's deal, this kept the UK, in their view, too closely regulatory aligned with the EU. They viewed that as wholly unacceptable, and their aim was to liberate, in their words, the UK as much as possible and to diverge much more radically than Mrs May's deal allowed for. And that, again, if you take at face value the comments that have been made by leading UK cabinet ministers, this is now the central goal of the government, a deregulatory purpose. Everything from food hygiene to financial services, from the environmental to the social regulation to state aids. This is for many in the Conservative Party what Brexit is now all about. And let me be clear, it's not just the EU that worries about deregulation. The UK Food and Drink Federation said that this is the death knell for frictionless trade and food prices would rise. The Society of Manufacturers and Traders said the automotive industry in the UK and EU was uniquely integrated and its priority was to avoid expensive tariffs and other behind-the-border barriers. The Chemical Industries Association said the industry continues to support regulatory alignment with our European counterparts, which represents the largest single market for our products. And I mention these three because they are three of the four biggest items we sell to the European Union. But if you take chemicals, in a scenario of minimum agreement to keep essential trade moving between the EU and the UK, REACH would apply to the UK as a third country. REACH is the registration, evaluation, authorisation and restriction of chemical regulation. It covers all the rules around chemicals. What that would mean for the UK is, firstly, UK exporters would have to find an importer into the 27 who was prepared to take responsibility for ensuring their products meet EU requirements. They would have to make filings even if the two rules remain the same, one with the UK regulator and one with the EU regulator. And these applications are seriously complex. Even major companies struggle with them. As the two regulatory regimes move apart, UK companies will need to employ legal, scientific, technical experts to follow both instead of the unitary approach that exists today. And this is likely, in the view of the chemical industry itself, to tempt some of them to relocate plants from the UK to the continent. Yet, this, I'm afraid, does not just look like what the government wants, the likely outcome, but it also looks like the government's desired outcome. David Frost, the Prime Minister's chief trade negotiator, said last week, and keeping up with all of this has been so difficult because it's been fast moving, people are making statements every day almost, said last week that the UK cannot have any involvement in European agencies that are overseen by the European Court of Justice. That includes alignment with regulators such as the European Medicines Agency, the European Chemicals Agency, the European Aviation Safety, and the European Food Safety Authority. So pretty clear. Britain will move to a system of regulatory cooperation, enabling it to develop its own rules and regulations. And the same person, David Frost, went on to say, it's the inevitable consequence of moving to a Canada-style free trade agreement. There are going to be two separate regulatory zones. The Prime Minister has made clear that we will not be a rule taker, and this is what he means by that. So, if no deal, or what many are calling a bare bones deal, is the outcome in December, and it's pretty bad for our services, for our companies that trade goods to the continent. But I'm afraid for our services sector, it's a disaster with bells on it. Such a scenario would mean, if there was no deal such a scenario that's been described so far would mean no deal on services, and services accounted for 41% of UK exports to the EU in 2018. As a result, the UK registered a euro 32.7 billion surplus on trade and services with the EU. And contrast that to the 110 billion euro deficit we have on trade in goods. The City of London's future access to the European financial market is worth something like 26 billion in annual exports, and this issue is going to have to be dealt with before June. UK-based banks, insurance firms and other financial services will lose their automatic right to operate in the EU at the end of the transition period in December. The UK will be looking for the EU to make what is known as an equivalence ruling to allow those firms to continue trading within the bloc. I have to emphasise, this will be a unilateral decision by the European Commission. This is not a matter for negotiation. It's the European Commission which will decide whether the UK has regulatory equivalence with the single market. Some of the key issues will be things like auditing, surveillance of banks, capital adequacy and other such issues. Now, there is no doubt, at least in my mind, I'm pretty sure there is no doubt anyway, that the EU will initially grant equivalence. Why wouldn't it? We're already part of the single market, we're already taking EU rules. The problem is, at the moment, that can be rescinded with a month's notice. The City of London has said that anything less than 3 years' notice would be a financial disaster for it. I put this up because this is Monday's Financial Times in the UK. I don't think it was reported in the Asian edition here, but if you look here, you'll see that Javid was demanding that we remain, if we once given financial equivalence, we should have it for decades. Let me tell you, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, there is zero chance of the European Union agreeing to that. There is no way that the European Commission is going to give up the right to determine the rules around financial equivalence and determine who meets those rules. So we're heading for a major crisis in financial services. But beyond financial services, the UK is a net exporter of other services such as professional and business services, telecommunications services, courier and postal services, distribution services, environmental services, transport services, and the list goes on. And without an agreement on services, our ability to deliver many of these into the single market will be seriously jeopardised. And this feeds back into the goods market. Our third biggest export are power generators. And if you sell a power generator, you have to send people with that generator to install it. You have to send engineers and technicians to maintain it. They would not necessarily, if there's no deal in services, get access for that. So you damage your service sector, but you could also damage your goods sector. Many, many more examples I could give, and we had a separate seminar here where I went through others last week. But let me just say that and I quote the Treasury figures because there are many, many figures, and some are more, sure, even bleaker situation than this. But according to the UK's own Treasury, the government's own Treasury Department, who, by the way, was told to shut up by Number 10 and not to publish these figures anymore, they say that with a bare bones deal that gives us good access on goods, this would cost our economy 4.9% after 15 years in lost GDP, whereas a no deal on goods or services would cost our economy 8% over the same 15-year period. The argument, of course, is that a UK freed from the shackles of EU membership would be free to strike trade deals with other countries. And this they claim will eventually compensate for any loss of EU trade. Firstly, this ignores the fact that the UK, through EU trade deals, already has preferential access to over 70 markets. And in addition to that, the EU has 750 international agreements, including 30 with the US on such things as insurance, reinsurance, wines and spirits, and other issues. The UK's stated aim is to roll over the existing 70 agreements. Not easy in the timescale available, it's only a year. So far, they have agreement to roll over 20, which I'm told amounts to a total of 2% of our trade. It's places like Brunei and other such, not unimportant, but not very exciting in terms of volume of trade countries. As I have explained in the seminar last week, that 49 plus 11 does not, because this is a 2018 figure, does not include Japan, does not include Singapore, and does not include the Vietnam trade agreement, which is probably going to be ratified by the European Parliament today. That takes us to something like 2/3 of our trade are either with the single market or with countries that the EU has a preferential trade deal with. The scope for further increasing, that's just quickly that in figures, but the scope for further change is not extensive. If you look at that graph, you find that we have unusually a significant trade surplus with the US. With America first being the mantra across the Atlantic, I find it difficult to see how we could do a trade deal that the US would sign up for that's going to increase our exports without dramatically increasing our imports from the US. And you will see that in terms of trade, nearly all our major countries are part of the single market. Of the top 10, 7 are in the single market, 7 are in the EU, Switzerland is in the single market, leaving us only with US and China. We know how easy it is, sarcasm, it is to penetrate the Chinese market, and as I say, we know how difficult it will be to get the US to increase trade. But that is where our great hope lies. Before moving on, let me just, again, for clarity, make it clear that I don't point any of this out for pleasure. I'm British. I'm going to have to live under this new situation. But I raise it in the hope that both the United Kingdom and the EU will recognise before it's too late that they have a common interest in trying to achieve the best possible trade deal, and some of the noise coming from both sides, but I have to be honest and say more from the UK side, that the noise from both sides is toned down and they do work to try and find a common solution. The potential economic woes I've outlined have had extensive coverage, and many of you will have heard these arguments before. What has had less coverage is the situation in terms of the other nations of the United Kingdom. The 3 devolved administrations, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, all voted against Brexit. They all voted against the deal that the Westminster government tried to push through. The people of Northern Ireland and Scotland voted against Brexit in the 2016 referendum, and in Scotland's case with a whopping majority of 62% against Brexit. And this has led our First Minister, who of course leads a government from the Nationalist Party, from the SNP, to declare that Scotland is being dragged out of the European Union against its will. And this line is gaining significant traction. An opinion poll by YouGov, the day I left for Singapore last weekend, a week ago on Saturday, put support for independence at 51 to 49%. Since then, there have been 2 further polls, both by different polling organisations, both showing a majority in favour of independence. And the view is that the tipping point from the 45% fairly solid support for independence we previously had to now a majority in favour of independence has been Brexit. When Scotland held its independence referendum in 2014, there was a pledge to say that this was, I want that one first actually, that this was, actually no, let me go back. When Scotland held its 2014 referendum, there was a pledge that this was only going to be a once in a generation vote. So Scottish National Party now says, yeah, that was our pledge, but leaving the EU is a material change of circumstances. Therefore, because there's been a material change of circumstances, we should have another vote. And I put this up. Scotsman is one of the more serious newspapers in Scotland, and you can see, and not traditionally, more importantly, not traditionally supporting of the nationalists, but you can see even they said farewell, not goodbye, and the text leads you to the view that one day Scotland will be back as an independent nation. More interestingly, the Daily Record, which is the biggest selling, it's a tabloid, biggest selling newspaper in Scotland, took the mickey out of the fact that the UK government issued on Brexit Day, 31st of January, a 50p coin to celebrate us leaving the European Union. And you can see their take on what they thought leaving the European Union would mean. But yeah, as I was saying, the leaving was a once in a generation, supposedly, decision, except, as I say, the Scottish Government argued, unless there's a change of material circumstances. So Nicholas, the problem is that the right to hold a referendum cannot be, is not a devolved matter. It's held by the Westminster Government. So you can only hold a referendum if the government agrees to you holding it. It's what's called a reserved matter. So Nicola Sturgeon requested, as First Minister of Scotland, the right to hold another referendum. And on the 14th of January, as you can see, Boris Johnson rather robustly rejected it. Now, personally, I don't think Nicola Sturgeon expected Boris Johnson to agree to such a referendum, but it's all part of the choreography, it's all part of the game that is being played. I also think that Boris Johnson, if I was Boris Johnson, I would have refused to hold a referendum at this time, because the way emotions were running, there could well have been a vote for independence. But, and this is important, but what we don't know is how this will play in the long run, because this is seen as Westminster ignoring Scotland, and have we created a kind of pressure cooker situation where the temperature is just going to build, and the more we put off the day of the referendum, the more the pressure for such a referendum grows. And there are some issues, and one of them might surprise you, but there are some issues that could well lead to the support for independence growing. And the most immediate is fishing, and that's a picture of a Scottish salmon, which is, after whisky, the UK's biggest drinks export is Scottish whisky, and the UK's biggest food export to the continent is Scottish salmon. The problem with fishing is that many, although Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU, our fishing communities voted to leave the European Union. So our coastal towns largely voted to get out, and they voted for Conservative in the last general election because of Boris Johnson's pledge to get Brexit done. And they've long complained about the common fisheries policy, and they've complained that foreign boats have access to Scottish waters, and I should make it clear, by foreign boats I mean European boats, Danish as one of them, exactly. And so what they expect is the Danish and the other 7, there's 8 European nationalities fishing Scottish waters, will all be banned from Scottish waters from the end of this year. What they were hoping was all be banned from Scottish waters, and they would have exclusive right to fish in the 200 miles around Scotland. But what they didn't account for is the fact that the high value part of the Scottish catch, and indeed the bulk of the Scottish catch, goes to the continent. And it's clear there's now going to be a fight of access to waters in return for access to markets. And it's not at all clear how that will be settled. And either way, Scottish fishermen are likely to lose out, because either they will not get their exclusive fishing rights that they had hoped for, or if we're banned from the EU market, they'll still find other markets, but the price they get for their product will go down, so they will lose financially. And although fishing is of relatively minor importance economically, it is, the Danes don't need to hear this either, it is incredibly important in a psychological sense, in an emotive sense. And the rumour that keeps circulating is that we will sell out the fishermen in order to get a better deal on the other issue I mentioned, financial services. The government continues to deny that, but we'll see what happens. The other Scottish, not quite unique, but other almost unique Scottish issue that's going to boil up is that one of the reasons many people voted for Brexit at a UK level was to stop free movement of people. And Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, has promised to introduce what he calls an Australian-style point system for immigration. The view is that you then only let in highly qualified people. It's a debate Singapore is quite familiar with. The problem for Scotland is, a bit like Singapore, is we have a declining and ageing population without migration. We have a higher death rate than we have birth rate. And our care sector, our hospitality sector, our seasonal agricultural sector are all heavily dependent, to a greater extent than the rest of the UK, on EU workers. So in either a ploy or a sensible policy move, the Scottish Government has asked for permission to have a Scottish visa, so a separate immigration system for Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. That has also been flatly rejected by the Westminster Government, and therefore becomes very easy if you find that hospitals don't have enough staff, if elderly people are not getting the care they need, if, as happened already, even without Brexit, because Brexit put some people coming off the UK, fruit lies rotting on our bushes. If all of these things start to happen, it's very easy for the Scottish First Minister to point at London and say, this is all happening because of your refusal to help us. And so there is a serious threat that this can all build over the years, and the longer you put off the referendum, the more independence becomes likely. I am not predicting, because I'd be a fool to predict one way or other, I'm not predicting how it will go, but there's a serious risk. I actually think the risk in Ireland is even greater. The situation is different in Northern Ireland, but it's probably more precarious. Because of shifting demographics in the north, majority sentiment there has moved away from the unionist community who prefer to remain part of the United Kingdom towards those who prefer unification with the Irish Republic. I hate putting it in those terms, but the fact is the Catholic community, which prefers unity with the South, is now bigger than the Protestant community, which prefers to be part of the United Kingdom. It's not even as simple as that, but that's the way the trend has gone. While we were members of the European Union, a lot of this pressure didn't exist because there was no border between North and South of Ireland, and if you travelled Ireland, you wouldn't have known which part of Ireland you were in. There was no customs posts, there was no regulatory checks because we had the same regulatory standards because we're in the European Union. No problem with free movement because we had free movement in the European Union. Brexit changes that, of course, and in the first phase of Brexit, the solution in order to keep the peace process going has been to create what has been described as a border down the North Sea. And that effectively means now there's a border inside the United Kingdom, because goods coming from Wales, England and Scotland going to Northern Ireland will be subject to regulatory and other food sanitary and phytosanitary and other checks. So you now have I don't think it's quite unique in the world, but an almost unique situation of a border inside the United Kingdom. And Michel Barnier, the British government's tried to play this down and say these checks will be minimum. In fact, Boris Johnson before the election tried to claim they wouldn't even exist. But Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, said that customs checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be indispensable. And he has said that the Good Friday Agreement and the withdrawal agreement make frictionless trade impossible between the UK mainland and Northern Ireland, and it makes checks indispensable. So he's under no illusions that there will be barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland has a 500-kilometre border with the Irish Republic, and it will be the only land border between the UK and the EU after Brexit. And the BBC, in an interesting article, pointed out that wheat grown in the north is sent to the south to be processed. Chickens grown in the south are sent to the north to be processed. That even iconic products like Guinness, Guinness is brewed in Dublin in the Republic, but sent north to be bottled. Bailey's Irish cream, because it has whiskey from the north, cream from the south, bottling elsewhere. Some people claim to produce a bottle of Bailey's Irish cream, you cross the border 9 times. This is the consequence of leaving, that all of this becomes far more complicated. And the general view is that the more the EU and the UK diverge, then the more Northern Ireland will diverge from Great Britain, and the more pressure will then grow for unification with the South. And the outcome of the election in the Republic of Ireland has added additional factors to this situation. Sinn Féin, which won the popular vote but not most seats, will almost certainly have to be part of any government, and its demand to be part of any government is what it calls an Irish unity referendum. And unlike Scotland, the pressure is the other way, because the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement that settled the troubles in Northern Ireland, says that when a majority in the north and a majority in the south wish a referendum on unity, and this is an international agreement, this is a legal international agreement, a referendum has to be held. And my guess is it won't happen tomorrow, it won't happen next year, and even Sinn Féin are saying there should be a 5-year lead up to it. But if in 5 years' time, if nothing changes and there's a referendum in Ireland, it will vote for the unification of Ireland. So the first bit of Britain will start to crumble. Let me conclude by saying it's a rather dreary and worrying scenario, but let me say, I don't think, despite what I've said, that it's inevitable that the UK is going to fall apart, and I don't think it's inevitable that the EU and the UK should end up the lowest common denominator trade deal. The EU and the UK both understand that despite Brexit, there is more that unites them than divides them. What is not clear, however, is that the vision, the leadership and the courage exists on both sides to avoid an acrimonious divorce. And this also matters to the EU in a way that perhaps some people don't understand, because it will damage the EU economically, but the EU also finds in the UK its most important partner in terms of internal and external security, and it wouldn't want to abandon that either. For Britain, all the reasons I've outlined on economic well-being, as well as the unification of its, keeping its nation unified, will all depend, I think, on avoiding a hard Brexit. So we need to hope, but as I was saying to the ambassador earlier over lunch when he stole my line when he said this to me, all of this actually matters to the wider world as well, without being particularly British or European chauvinistic about it. We have in Donald Trump an American president who opposes key elements of the global order, including free trade and existing alliances. We have Vladimir Putin, who wants to overthrow the order because he believes it poses a direct threat to his regime. We have in China Xi Jinping, who benefits from the open global economy but only pays lip service to its rules. The EU, the UK, whatever their differences, supports multilateralism. They support a rules-based global trading system and indeed a rules-based global system. And I think it's in all our interest that we continue to work together, and that we work with like-minded partners like Singapore to make sure we preserve and reform the global order in a way that's fair to all of us. Thank you.